Officer, before this goes any further, I strongly suggest you make one phone call. Major General David Carter said it without anger, standing beneath the pale afternoon sun near a veterans memorial outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, while Officer Mark Reynolds stared at him as though calmness itself were suspicious. David was 52, broad-shouldered but relaxed, dressed in a dark civilian jacket, blue button-down shirt, khaki slacks, and polished brown shoes. Nothing about him announced military command. No uniform, no stars, no security detail. Just a black man carrying a slim leather folder and walking toward a restricted parking area less than 20 miles from Fort Liberty. Reynolds had noticed him near the access gate and decided almost immediately that something did not look right. You cannot just walk through here, the officer said. David stopped. I am aware of the access rules. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. Then why are you heading toward a controlled area? David reached slowly into his jacket and produced military identification. Because I am authorized to be there. Reynolds took the card, glanced at the photograph, then at David. His eyes moved across the credential too quickly. This does not tell me why you are here. David studied him for a moment. It tells you enough to verify me. A breeze moved through the flags surrounding the memorial. Nearby, several older veterans were leaving an afternoon gathering, their conversations fading as they noticed the patrol vehicle and the two men facing each other. Reynolds turned the identification over in his hand. You expect me to believe you have access to that area? David's expression changed only slightly. I expect you to verify the credential you are holding. The answer seemed to irritate Reynolds. He stepped closer and pointed toward the public sidewalk. Back up and stay over there while I figure this out. David remained where he was. Officer, I am not interfering with you. I said step back. David looked toward the body camera mounted on Reynolds' uniform. A small indicator light showed that it was recording. Good. Keep that recording, David said. Reynolds gave a short, humorless laugh. You think the camera is going to help you? David's eyes stayed on his. I think an accurate record helps everyone. That was when Reynolds placed a hand against David's upper arm and directed him one step away from the gate. It was brief, unnecessary, and enough to change the atmosphere around them. David did not react physically. He simply steadied himself and looked at Reynolds with the expression of a man who had spent more than 30 years learning that discipline was most valuable when someone else had forgotten theirs. Imagine having the authority to command thousands of soldiers, yet choosing not to reveal it because the real test was whether another human being would respect you before learning your rank. David could have ended the uncertainty immediately. One sentence, one title, one call. Instead, he wanted to see whether procedure would work without prestige forcing it to. Call the base, he said. Reynolds folded his arms. I do not need you telling me who to call. Then contact the military liaison listed in the credential system. I will decide what needs to be verified. David glanced toward the leather folder tucked beneath his arm. Inside were briefing notes for a division command meeting scheduled later that afternoon, along with a movement schedule involving senior officers who were already on their way from Fort Liberty. Reynolds had no idea what he was looking at. To him, David was simply a black man standing somewhere Reynolds had decided he did not belong. The officer reached for his radio and requested another unit. David exhaled slowly. You are making this more complicated than it needs to be. Reynolds answered with a faint smirk. That depends on what you are hiding. David looked beyond him toward the road. In the distance, barely visible through the afternoon haze, several dark military vehicles turned onto the access route. David recognized the formation immediately. Reynolds did not. Not yet. The dark military vehicles were still more than half a mile away when Officer Mark Reynolds noticed them, but he paid little attention. His focus remained fixed on David Carter, who stood several feet from the access gate with his leather folder tucked beneath one arm and the same controlled expression he had worn from the beginning. Reynolds spoke into his radio and requested identification verification, giving David's name and credential number to dispatch. Then he lowered the radio and looked at him again. You said you were coming from the veterans gathering? Yes. And where are you going now? David glanced toward the controlled parking area. To a scheduled meeting. Reynolds waited. With who? David's eyes settled on him. Military personnel. The answer only seemed to deepen Reynolds' suspicion. That is pretty vague. David nodded slightly. Because you do not need operational details to verify whether I am authorized to enter. Reynolds gave a faint smile that carried no warmth. You really like telling people what they need, do you not? David said nothing. Years of command had taught him that silence could reveal far more about a person than argument ever could. Around them, the veterans leaving the memorial had slowed their pace. One older man, wearing a faded army cap, stopped near a bench and watched from about 30 feet away. Another veteran stood beside him, arms folded, saying nothing. Reynolds noticed the attention and straightened his shoulders. Let me explain something, he said. Until I know exactly why you are here, you are not going anywhere near that gate. David looked at the military identification still in Reynolds' hand. Then verify it properly. I am doing that. You have not called the base. Reynolds' jaw tightened. Dispatch is enough. David glanced toward the body camera again. Still recording. Dispatch may not have access to the command verification system. And you would know that how? David almost answered, then stopped himself. The truth was obvious to him. He had spent decades inside those systems. He knew who could verify his identity, how long it should take, and which office would answer immediately if Reynolds called. But revealing too much would turn the moment into a test of rank instead of a test of procedure. Call the military liaison, David repeated. Reynolds shook his head. You keep acting like you are in charge here. David's expression remained steady. No, I am asking you to follow the process. A second patrol vehicle turned into the memorial parking area. Officer Daniel Price stepped out, a younger white officer with a cautious expression, and walked toward them. Reynolds gave him a quick summary. Possible unauthorized access. Military identification that I have not been able to verify. He keeps insisting I call the base. Price looked toward David. Is the identification obviously altered? Reynolds hesitated. Not obviously. Does the photograph match? Yes. Price looked at the card again. Then why not make the call? Reynolds turned toward him. Because I am handling it. David watched the exchange without interrupting. The pattern was becoming familiar. Every new fact should have reduced suspicion, but Reynolds seemed to treat each question as a challenge to his authority. Price stepped closer to David. Sir, do you have any other identification? David handed him a driver's license. Price checked the name. Same face, same address region. This matches, he said. Reynolds crossed his arms. That does not prove access. David finally spoke. No, the military credential proves access. You simply have to verify it. Price looked down the road. The approaching convoy was closer now, perhaps a quarter-mile away. 3 dark government vehicles followed by 2 military utility vehicles moved in disciplined spacing toward the gate. Reynolds glanced at them for the first time with real attention. Are you expecting someone? He asked. David looked toward the vehicles, then back at Reynolds. Yes. Who? David paused. People who are going to wonder why their meeting started without me. Reynolds gave a dismissive breath, but Price was no longer smiling. He looked from the convoy to David's credential and then toward the folder under David's arm. Through the partially open cover, a printed heading was visible, Division Command Briefing. Price's expression changed. Mark, he said quietly, I think you should make that phone call. Reynolds stared at him. Then the first military vehicle slowed near the gate. The second followed. Doors opened almost at once. A woman in army uniform stepped out, looked across the parking area, spotted David, and immediately straightened. Reynolds turned toward her. David did not move. He already knew what was coming next. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell stepped away from the first military vehicle and immediately fixed her eyes on David Carter. The change in her posture was subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders squared, her expression sharpened, and she moved with the focused precision of someone who had just recognized the senior officer she had been expecting. Officer Daniel Price noticed it first. Mark Reynolds noticed it a second later. Sarah crossed the remaining distance, stopped several feet from David, and raised a formal salute. General Carter, sir. The words seemed to drain the noise from the parking area. Reynolds looked at David, then at Sarah, then back at the military identification still in his hand. David returned the salute calmly. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. 2 more officers stepped from the convoy behind her, followed by a civilian military liaison carrying a tablet and a folder. Each recognized David immediately. None looked confused about why he was there. Sarah glanced toward Reynolds. Is there a problem, General? David answered without accusation. Officer Reynolds was verifying my access. Sarah's eyes moved toward the credential. That credential is active. General Carter is cleared for this facility and the command area beyond it. Reynolds swallowed. General? Sarah looked directly at him. Major General David Carter, commanding general of the division. The older veterans near the memorial exchanged quiet looks. Price lowered his gaze briefly, as if replaying the last 10 minutes in his mind. Reynolds stared again at the identification card, only now reading every line he had barely glanced at before. The rank had been there. The command designation had been there. The verification information had been there. Nothing on the card had changed. Only his willingness to believe it had. I was not informed who he was, Reynolds said. David's expression remained controlled. You were given valid identification. Reynolds looked toward him. I had to make sure. That is what verification is for. Sarah did not interrupt. She understood immediately that this was no longer about rank. David had spent his entire career teaching younger officers that authority carried responsibility in both directions. A commander who demanded standards had to live by them. A public officer should be no different. Price stepped closer to Reynolds. Mark, give him the identification back. Reynolds hesitated, then handed it to David. I was doing my job. David took the card and placed it carefully into his wallet. Then let the record show exactly how you did it. Reynolds glanced toward his body camera. The small light was still active. His confidence weakened another degree. Sarah looked toward David. Sir, the division briefing begins in 12 minutes. The staff is waiting. David nodded. We will be there. He picked up the leather folder that had shifted beneath his arm and turned toward the gate. Reynolds watched the printed words on its cover become fully visible for the first time. Division Command Briefing. Senior Leadership Attendance. David had told him almost everything he needed to know without once demanding special treatment. Reynolds had simply chosen not to listen. General Carter, Reynolds called. David stopped, but did not turn immediately. I did not know your rank. David looked back. That is the part you still do not understand. The parking area became quiet again. My rank should not be the reason you decide to treat me correctly. Reynolds said nothing. David continued toward the convoy. Sarah walked beside him, while Price remained near the patrol vehicles, visibly uncomfortable. The moment could have ended there, with embarrassment and nothing more. But Sarah had already noticed the body camera. So had David. Before entering the vehicle, he looked toward her. Make sure the encounter is preserved through the proper channels. Sarah nodded. Yes, sir. No special treatment. Understood. David entered the vehicle, and the convoy began moving toward the gate. Reynolds stood beside his patrol car watching it disappear into the controlled area. Minutes earlier, he had believed he was dealing with a man who needed to prove he belonged. Now he knew that man commanded thousands of soldiers. But the realization that stayed with him was not the stars on David's uniform waiting inside the base. It was the fact that none of those stars had been necessary for David to deserve respect in the first place. Inside the command building, David Carter entered the briefing room with Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell at his side and took his place at the head of a long table surrounded by senior officers, operations staff, and division planners. A digital map filled the wall behind him, marked with training areas, logistics routes, and upcoming readiness exercises. No one mentioned what had happened outside. David did not want the incident to become the center of the day. He opened the leather folder, reviewed the first page, and began the meeting exactly on schedule. We are 12 minutes behind, he said. Let us make up the time. His voice was calm, precise, and familiar to everyone in the room. Within seconds, the staff returned to work. Across town, Officer Mark Reynolds sat inside his patrol vehicle with the engine running and the body camera footage already preserved by department policy. Daniel Price stood outside the passenger door, arms folded, looking toward the access road where the convoy had disappeared. You should have called the base, Price said. Reynolds stared through the windshield. I was checking him out. You had valid identification. Reynolds looked at him. You saw how he was talking to me. Price shook his head. He was answering you. That sentence stayed in the vehicle longer than either man expected. Reynolds turned off the engine and stepped out just as Captain Robert Hayes arrived. Hayes was a white officer in his early 50s with a reputation for being direct and careful about procedure. He had already received a call from the military liaison. Walk me through it, he said. Reynolds began with the access concern, the identification, and his decision to request backup. Hayes listened without interrupting. Then he asked, did the credential appear altered? No. Did the photograph match? Yes. Did he refuse? Identification? No. Did dispatch confirm the credential was invalid? Reynolds hesitated. Dispatch could not fully verify the command access. Hayes looked toward Price. What did you recommend? Price answered quietly. I suggested calling the base. Hayes turned back to Reynolds. Did you? No. Why not? Reynolds exhaled. I did not think it was necessary. Hayes let the answer sit for a moment. And you physically redirected him away from the gate. Reynolds' expression tightened. I moved him back one step. Was he advancing toward you? No. Was he attempting to cross the gate after being told to stop? No. Hayes looked down at the notes in his hand. Then we are going to preserve the body camera footage and conduct a supervisory review. Reynolds stared at him. Because he is a general? Hayes lifted his eyes. No. Because the sequence needs review. The distinction was immediate. It was the same distinction David had been making from the beginning. Back inside the command building, the briefing ended shortly after 5. Sarah remained behind while the other officers filed out. Sir, the police department requested confirmation of your credentials and access status. David closed the folder. Give them what they need. They also asked whether you want to make a formal complaint. David looked toward the window overlooking the installation road. Not yet. Sarah waited. I want the video reviewed first. Yes, sir. And I do not want anyone calling the department to demand an outcome. Sarah nodded. Understood. David stood. This is not about embarrassing an officer because he failed to recognize rank. He picked up the folder. If his actions were within policy, the record will show that. If they were not, the record should show that too. Sarah studied him. And the racial aspect? David paused. That is harder to prove from one encounter. His voice remained measured. But it is impossible to ignore the question when every valid answer became another reason for suspicion. Several miles away, Captain Hayes had reached the same problem from a different direction. He stood in a small review room watching Reynolds' body camera footage. From the beginning, David presenting identification. Reynolds questioning the access. David asking for verification. Reynolds refusing to call the base. Then the brief moment when Reynolds directed him backward. Hayes replayed the sequence once. Then again, Daniel Price stood beside him. What do you think? Price asked. Hayes did not answer immediately. I think the first question is whether Reynolds followed procedure. He paused the recording on David's face. The second question is why the procedure stopped being enough once the man holding valid identification did not fit what Reynolds expected to see. Price looked at the frozen image. The stars on David's uniform were nowhere in sight. That was what made the question impossible to avoid. By the next morning, Captain Robert Hayes had watched the body camera footage enough times to know the problem could not be reduced to one misunderstood credential. He sat in a small conference room at the police department with internal affairs investigator Karen Whitmore, a veteran administrator known for separating assumptions from evidence. On the screen, David Carter stood near the access gate in civilian clothes, speaking calmly while Mark Reynolds held his military identification. Whitmore paused the recording. At this point, what information did Officer Reynolds have? Hayes looked at his notes. Valid military identification. Matching civilian identification. No evidence the credential was altered. No attempt to enter after being told to wait. Whitmore advanced the footage. David asked Reynolds to call the base. Reynolds refused. She paused again. And here, Hayes answered, a second officer recommends verification through the installation. Whitmore nodded. Which does not happen. She continued the recording until Reynolds directed David one step away from the gate. The room fell quiet. Was there a safety reason documented for that contact? She asked. Not in the initial report. Was General Carter attempting to cross the controlled boundary? No. Whitmore leaned back. Then we need Reynolds' explanation, not our interpretation. That afternoon, Reynolds entered the same room with a department representative present. He looked tired but defensive. Whitmore began with simple questions. Why did you stop Mr. Carter? Access concern. Reasonable at first, she said. What changed after he presented valid identification? Reynolds looked toward the screen. I still did not know why he was there. Did he have to explain the purpose of a command meeting to establish that his credential was valid? Reynolds hesitated. I thought he was being evasive. Whitmore wrote something down. What did he refuse to provide? Another pause. He would not give operational details. Were you entitled to those details? Reynolds looked at Hayes. Hayes remained silent. I was trying to determine whether he belonged there. Whitmore turned the monitor toward him. He gave you a credential specifically designed to establish that. Reynolds's expression tightened. I did not trust it. Why? The question was quiet. That made it harder. Reynolds looked down. Something felt off. Whitmore did not move on. What specifically? He opened his mouth, then stopped. No altered seal. No mismatched photograph. No expired date. No contradictory identification. Nothing he could point to except the conclusion he had formed before verification was complete. Across Fort Liberty, David sat with Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell after a morning readiness briefing. She placed a copy of the police department's preservation notice on his desk. Internal Affairs has opened a preliminary review. David read the first page. Good. Sarah watched him. They are asking whether you want to submit a statement. I will. Do you want legal present? David considered it. Only if procedure requires it. I do not want this turned into a contest between institutions. Sarah nodded. David looked through the window toward rows of military vehicles moving across the installation. The part that matters happened before anyone saluted me. Sarah understood. When he did not know your rank. Exactly. David closed the notice. Once the convoy arrived, everyone suddenly knew how to behave. That proves nothing about whether the system works for someone without a convoy. Later that day, David gave his statement by secure video conference. He described the veterans' gathering, the access gate, the identification, the request for verification, and Reynolds's refusal to call the base. He did not claim to know what Reynolds had been thinking. When Whitmore asked whether he believed race influenced the encounter, David paused before answering. I cannot testify to another man's thoughts. I can tell you that every piece of information I provided should have reduced suspicion, yet the suspicion kept increasing. Whitmore wrote the sentence down exactly. David continued. That deserves examination whether I am a black general, a black mechanic, or anyone else. After the interview, Whitmore returned to Reynolds's report and noticed a phrase that had not stood out before. Subject displayed an unusually authoritative manner. She compared it with the body camera footage. David had never raised his voice, never threatened, never attempted to cross the gate. He had asked questions. He had requested verification. Whitmore circled the phrase. By 5:30, she had requested a review of several previous citizen complaints involving Reynolds, not to assume a pattern, but to determine whether similar language appeared elsewhere. Hayes looked at her request. You think there is more? Whitmore shook her head. I think we do not know yet. Then she looked back at the frozen image of David standing beneath the memorial flags. But when an officer describes calm confidence as suspicious, I want to know who else he has described that way. The next morning, Karen Whitmore received 5 years of complaint summaries involving Officer Mark Reynolds, and at first glance they looked ordinary. Traffic questions, access disputes, citizen concerns, supervisory notes. But when she began comparing the language, certain phrases appeared often enough to demand attention. Subject became argumentative. Subject displayed an authoritative attitude. Subject questioned lawful instructions. Whitmore placed the files side by side and read them again. In 3 of the complaints, the citizens had been black men. In 2, they had presented valid identification early in the encounter. In 1, a retired school principal had been described as unusually confrontational, even though the available audio showed a controlled voice asking for clarification. Whitmore did not call it a pattern yet. She called it a reason to keep looking. Captain Robert Hayes joined her near noon. What do you have? He asked. She tapped the reports. Repeated language. Similar escalation points. Not enough for a conclusion, but enough to compare against recordings where we have them. Hayes picked up 1 file. How many have video? 2 complete, 1 partial. They started with the oldest. On the screen, Reynolds questioned a black contractor outside a municipal building after the man had shown both a driver's license and a work badge. The contractor asked why he was still being detained. Reynolds answered that his attitude was making the situation more difficult. Whitmore paused the video. Hayes looked toward her. Neither spoke. The second recording involved a veteran leaving a community event. Different location. Different facts. Same moment when questions were treated as defiance. Across Fort Liberty, David Carter was reviewing division readiness reports when Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell entered with an update. Internal Affairs expanded the review. David looked up from the briefing packet. Because of my statement? Because of prior complaints. He leaned back slightly. How many? They did not give a number. David nodded. Good. They should not be briefing me on personnel details. Sarah studied him. Most people in your position would want to know everything. David closed the packet. That is exactly why I should know less. I am part of the complaint. The answer reflected the discipline he had demanded from everyone else. Power meant knowing when not to use access simply because it was available. Later that afternoon, Reynolds returned for a second interview. Whitmore placed one of the old reports in front of him. Do you remember this stop? Reynolds glanced at the name. Vaguely. You described the individual as confrontational. If that is what I wrote, then yes. Whitmore played a short portion of the body camera recording. The man on screen spoke evenly. Officer, I showed you my work identification. Can you tell me why I am still being held here? Whitmore stopped the video. What about that was confrontational? Reynolds shifted in his chair. It was the way he kept questioning everything. Whitmore looked at him. Like General Carter? Reynolds' face tightened. That is not the same situation. I agree. The facts are different. She turned another page. The question is whether your interpretation is similar. Reynolds looked toward Hayes, but Hayes remained silent. Whitmore continued. When someone speaks calmly but challenges your reasoning, do you tend to hear disrespect? Reynolds leaned back. People on the street do not always understand officer safety. That is true. Whitmore's tone remained neutral. But officer safety is not a substitute for articulable facts. The room went quiet. Reynolds looked at the files. For the first time, the review was no longer about the embarrassment of failing to recognize a general. It was about how he interpreted people before rank, occupation, or status entered the picture. At the same time, David attended a division leadership meeting where the incident was never mentioned until the final agenda item. Sarah asked whether he wanted guidance sent to soldiers about interactions with local law enforcement. David considered it carefully. No special message about me. Then what? Remind everyone of the existing process. Identification, verification, documentation. Nothing more. Sarah nodded. David looked around the table at the colonels and senior staff officers who reported to him. And make one thing clear. Rank does not excuse anyone from lawful procedures. A colonel across the table asked. Even after what happened? David answered without hesitation. Especially after what happened. That evening, Whitmore completed a preliminary memorandum recommending a broader review of Reynolds' prior stops involving identity, access, and perceived noncompliance. She did not recommend punishment. Not yet. She recommended comparison. Facts. Video. Reports. Sequence. Hayes read the final paragraph twice. You think this could become bigger than Carter's complaint? Whitmore closed the file. It already is. She looked through the office window toward the darkening parking lot. The general had a convoy arrive and make everyone reconsider what they were seeing. I want to know what happened to the people who never had one. By the end of the week, Karen Whitmore had enough material to bring the expanded review before a departmental oversight panel. The meeting took place in a plain conference room with no cameras, no press, and no dramatic speeches. Captain Robert Hayes sat at one end of the table. Two senior supervisors, a legal advisor, and a training commander filled the remaining seats. Whitmore placed several files in front of them. These incidents are not identical, she began. That distinction matters. But we are seeing repeated moments where valid identification or reasonable explanations failed to reduce suspicion once Officer Reynolds had already formed an initial judgment. One supervisor opened the first report. How many complaints are we talking about? 5 with enough documentation for comparison. 3 involve black men. 2 involve white citizens. The issue is not only race. The issue is whether perceived challenge to authority repeatedly influenced his decision-making. Hayes leaned forward. And Carter's encounter? Whitmore answered carefully. It is the best documented example because the entire sequence is captured clearly. But it should not be treated as proof of everything else. The legal advisor nodded. So what are you recommending? A formal administrative investigation into Reynolds' conduct, a review of supervisory handling in the earlier complaints, and temporary removal from access control assignments while the review is active. No one spoke for several seconds. The training commander looked down at the reports. What about broader policy? Whitmore slid another document forward. Training on verification, de-escalation, and the difference between noncompliance and respectful questioning. We also need supervisors to review encounters where an officer's suspicion increases after identification has already been confirmed. Across Fort Liberty, David Carter knew none of those details. He was leading a morning command update when Sarah Mitchell received a message from the local department confirming that the review had expanded. She waited until the meeting ended before telling him. David gathered his papers slowly. Did they ask for anything from us? Only confirmation of the original access record and your statement. Then give them that. Sarah hesitated. Sir, some of the staff are angry. David looked at her. At the officer? At the way you were treated. David closed the folder. Anger can identify a problem. It cannot replace evidence. Sarah nodded. Still, people think there should be consequences. David walked toward the window overlooking the installation. Soldiers crossed the parking area below in small groups, carrying folders, laptops, and coffee cups. There may be, he said, but not because I command a division. He turned back toward her. If the facts show misconduct, the consequence should come from the facts. If they do not, my rank should not create one. That afternoon, Reynolds was informed that the investigation had formally expanded. He sat in the same interview room with Whitmore, this time without the confidence he had shown during the first session. You are reviewing 5 years of my work because of one complaint, he asked. Whitmore shook her head. We are reviewing specific incidents because earlier records contain similar concerns. Reynolds looked toward Hayes. And everybody suddenly cares because Carter is a general. Hayes answered before Whitmore could. His rank made the incident visible. It did not create the recordings. Reynolds looked down at the table. Whitmore placed a transcript in front of him from the contractor stop reviewed earlier. You described this man as argumentative. The recording shows him asking why he was still being detained after his work identification was confirmed. She placed David's transcript beside it. You described General Carter as unusually authoritative after he asked you to verify his credential. Reynolds stared at the pages. People can sound calm and still be difficult. Of course, Whitmore said. But difficult is not a legal standard. The room fell silent. Reynolds looked from one transcript to the other. For years, he had treated his instinct as experience, his irritation as warning, and other people's questions as signs that something was wrong. Now those judgments were being separated from the uniform and placed under ordinary light. So what happens now, he asked. Whitmore closed the file. Now we keep looking. Several miles away, David was finishing another day of command responsibilities when Sarah entered with one final message. The department had asked whether he would participate in a policy discussion after the investigation concluded. David considered it. Only if the other complainants are invited too. Sarah looked surprised. Why? David picked up his coat. Because I already had people ready to listen when my rank became known. He paused at the door. The people who matter most are the ones who were telling the truth before anyone important showed up. 3 weeks later, the administrative investigation reached the stage Mark Reynolds had spent every day hoping would never come. Karen Whitmore entered the conference room carrying the final review packet, followed by Captain Robert Hayes and a department legal advisor. Reynolds sat across from them without his patrol gear, his hands folded on the table, the confidence from the memorial encounter long gone. Whitmore opened the file. The investigation examined your encounter with Major General Carter and 4 earlier incidents with comparable documentation. Reynolds looked down, and Whitmore did not rush. The review found repeated instances where verified identification and reasonable explanations failed to reduce your suspicion, and where respectful questioning was documented as argumentative or confrontational behavior. Reynolds shifted slightly. So you are saying I am racist? Whitmore shook her head. We are describing documented conduct. We are not claiming to know every thought behind it. She turned a page. The findings conclude that your handling of General Carter's access verification was inconsistent with department expectations, particularly after valid identification was presented and another officer recommended contacting the installation directly. Hayes remained silent while Reynolds stared at the report. What happens to me? He asked. You will remain removed from access control duties while formal discipline is completed, Whitmore said. You will also undergo retraining and enhanced supervisory review before returning to independent field assignments. Reynolds looked toward Hayes. Because I did not recognize a general? Hayes answered quietly. No, because you did not recognize when the facts should have changed your judgment. That sentence stayed with Reynolds after the meeting ended. Across town, David Carter entered a community meeting room near Fayetteville wearing civilian clothes again, not a uniform. The department had invited him to a policy discussion, but David had insisted the earlier complainants be included. 3 citizens sat around the table with him. One was Charles Freeman, the retired black school principal whose calm questions had once been described as confrontational. Another was Thomas Reed, a contractor who had shown work identification during a disputed stop. The third was a white veteran whose complaint had raised similar concerns about how Reynolds responded to questioning. Karen Whitmore and Robert Hayes sat across from them. No cameras were present. No reporters waited outside. David preferred it that way. Before we discuss policy, Hayes said, I want to acknowledge that some earlier complaints were not examined as carefully as they should have been. Charles Freeman looked at him. I told your department exactly what happened. Hayes nodded. I know. Charles folded his hands. Then why did it take a general for anyone to listen? The room became still. David did not rescue anyone from the question. Hayes answered after several seconds. That is something we have to own. Whitmore opened a folder containing proposed changes. Supervisors would now be required to review encounters where verified identification failed to resolve an officer's stated suspicion. Training would distinguish lawful questioning from actual obstruction or threatening behavior. Access disputes involving military credentials would include direct verification procedures with installation contacts when available. David listened carefully. Do not write policy around my rank, he said. Whitmore looked up. We are not. Good. Because the most important person in the next encounter may be someone whose name nobody recognizes. Charles nodded slowly. Later that afternoon, David returned to Fort Liberty for a division briefing. Sarah Mitchell met him outside the command building. How did the meeting go? Better than I expected. Did the department accept responsibility? David considered the question. They accepted that the process failed people before it failed me. Sarah walked beside him toward the entrance. And Reynolds. Formal discipline. Retraining. Oversight. Sarah looked at him. Is that enough? David stopped for a moment. Soldiers moved through the hallway beyond the glass doors, some young enough to have been born after David first put on a uniform. Enough is the wrong question, he said. The question is whether the next person gets treated differently. That evening, Reynolds sat alone in a training room watching footage from several encounters, including his own. For the first time, he was instructed not to focus on whether each person had been polite, deferential, or easy to deal with. He was told to identify only facts. Valid identification, confirmed access, observable behavior, articulable risk. When the footage of David appeared, Reynolds watched himself dismiss the credential, refuse the verification call, and interpret calm confidence as challenge. The instructor paused the screen. What should have happened here? Reynolds looked at the frozen image for a long time. I should have verified the identification and let the facts decide what came next. The instructor nodded. No applause. No dramatic forgiveness. Just an answer Reynolds should have understood from the beginning. Miles away, David stood at the head of a division conference table preparing for another command meeting. Thousands of soldiers ultimately answered through the chain of command beneath him, but the lesson he carried from the memorial had nothing to do with how much power he held. It was about what power was supposed to do when confronted with uncertainty. Slow down, verify, and remember that respect should never have to wait for rank. Several months later, the Veterans Memorial outside Fayetteville looked almost exactly as it had on the afternoon David Carter was stopped there. The same flags moved in the Carolina breeze. The same access road curved toward the controlled gate. Cars entered, paused, verified credentials, and continued without drama. David returned for a small remembrance ceremony wearing civilian clothes, a dark jacket over a blue shirt. No stars visible, no staff surrounding him. A few veterans recognized him. Most people did not. He preferred it that way. After the ceremony, he walked toward the parking area and noticed a young black veteran standing near the gate while an officer checked his identification. The interaction lasted less than a minute. The officer examined the card, asked one clarifying question, contacted the verification number listed in the system, then returned the identification with a respectful nod. No suspicion stretched beyond the facts. No unnecessary argument followed. David watched from a distance and kept walking. He did not know whether the officer had ever heard his name. That did not matter. What mattered was that the process worked for someone who carried no visible rank at all. Across town, Mark Reynolds was finishing another supervised training session. He had returned to limited duties but had not yet been cleared for independent access control assignments. The instructor placed several scenario cards on the table. Each described a person whose behavior could be interpreted in more than one way. Calm but questioning. Frustrated but compliant. Confident without being threatening. Reynolds read them more slowly now. Months earlier, he might have treated tone as evidence. Now he was required to identify observable facts first. "What do you know?" the instructor asked. Reynolds looked at the first scenario. Valid identification. What else? No attempt to enter after being told to wait. What else? Reynolds paused. Nothing that establishes a threat. The instructor nodded. Then what comes next? Verification. The answer sounded simple. That was what made it difficult to forget. At Fort Liberty, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell later handed David a short policy summary showing that the Department and Military Liaison Office had completed the revised access verification procedures discussed months earlier. David read it once and placed it on his desk. "Any special language about senior officers?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "No, sir. Same standard for everyone." David smiled faintly. "Good." She remained near the door. "Do you think the whole thing changed Reynolds?" David considered the question. People are not policies. You cannot certify a person's character with one review. Sarah nodded. But David looked toward the window where soldiers crossed between buildings under the late afternoon sun. You can make it harder for one person's assumptions to become everyone else's problem. A week later, David attended the final community policy session with Charles Freeman, Thomas Reed, several local officers, and department supervisors. The discussion was quieter than the first one. There was less anger in the room, but not because anyone had forgotten what happened. The difference was that concrete changes now existed. Complaints involving identity disputes would receive structured supervisory comparison. Access officers would use direct verification channels when credentials were valid but unfamiliar. Training would explicitly separate respectful questioning from genuine safety concerns. Charles looked toward David after the meeting. "Funny how all this started because they did not know who you were." David shook his head. "No, it started because who I was should never have mattered." Charles smiled. "That sounds like something a general would say." David looked toward the door. "It is something anyone should be able to say." Later that evening, David drove past the memorial alone. The sky had turned orange behind the trees, and the flagpoles cast long shadows across the pavement. He slowed near the gate where Reynolds had once stood holding his identification, then continued without stopping. He thought about rank, authority, uniforms, and all the symbols people used to decide who deserves to be heard. He had commanded soldiers across decades of service. He had made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Yet the lesson that remained from that afternoon was simpler than anything written in a command manual. Power reveals itself most clearly before it knows who is standing in front of it. Reynolds had learned David's rank too late for it to excuse what happened, but early enough for the record to force a change. David drove toward the installation lights ahead, carrying no satisfaction from another man's discipline, only one expectation for the system left behind. The next person should not need stars on his shoulders before respect finally arrives.